Okay, so it's Kyle Kingsley. This is CEOMD. Kyle, I'm so excited to do this with you.
Thank you. Very excited. I appreciate your time.
So over, the next few months, we'll be talking about how it's possible that a guy could be an MD and also a CEO. It is perfect for you to be both of those things here in cannabis. As far as Vireo is concerned, you provide medical cannabis in a number of states.
Yeah, you hit it on the head. Physicians are notoriously poor business people. And I think I met that mark 15 years ago when I dived into entrepreneurship, but I have been beaten down thoroughly and humbled by business. And so I came into the cannabis space very humbled from a business standpoint. So generally speaking, I'm not sure that you want to mix the MD and business, kind of sectors together, but feeling very fortunate to have this opportunity and the past that I've had with entrepreneurship.
Yeah, and we'll get to the business side of things. This first one is just an overview of your thoughts on healthcare, the healthcare industry, what we mean by healthcare. And so if you could go step in the Wayback Machine and go back to medical school and what you expected, then what actually was reality when you got into the healthcare space, and then eventually, how your path crossed with cannabis. That would be great. And then we can kind of end with where you see healthcare going. So all the way back, here's young Kyle, right? Entering medical school, raring to go, right?
Yeah, always dangerous to talk to somebody who's been, deeply entrenched in the U.S. medical system for any long period of time. But I will try to suspend some of my cynicism. When I think I can speak for most medical students when they enter medical school, there's a little bit of naivete, but there's all that kind of beautiful. Just the beautiful ideology of youth, where you really idealize kind of your direction and what you're doing. And I was very excited, obviously, about the opportunity to go to medical school. I've always been fascinated with biology and human biology in particular. And the opportunity to become a physician was just, it was amazing. And so very, very humbled that I had that opportunity. Medical school, you're very excited about medicine, generally speaking. I've always been kind of frenetic and a little bit scattered in my approach to things. I like doing a lot of different things. And so that led me to emergency medicine. I was fortunate to do an emergency medicine residency at Hennepin County Medical Center. And if you want to shock somebody's naivete out of them, I would have them train in the emergency medicine residency at Hennepin County. You really see the difficulties of not just society at large, but also the healthcare system. And so it was amazing. There's no better place in the world to train, in my opinion, in the emergency medicine realm than Hennepin County. But it definitely was eye-opening and a very amazing job. I then moved on to a suburban emergency department where I worked for about 10 years doing night shifts. And I was able to really see, again, just sort of the upsides and downsides of the U.S. medical system. I was able to witness firsthand the substantial problem that we have with chronic opioid use. And you really see the chinks in the armor of the U.S. system, which is, primary care is underemphasized. A lot of folks use the emergency department as their primary care physician, which obviously is very expensive and inefficient. And I also saw just sort of the lack of value add that the insurance companies bring to the table, just an administrative burden and a lot of hoops for both patients and providers to jump through without a significant value add on the backside. So I went from this very idealistic, very excited medical student to somebody who had a very kind of much more stark view, realistic view of the healthcare system here in the United States.
Let's further dive in there. So we are, pointing out, we'll get to opioids later, but we're pointing out that not a whole lot of value add as far as insurance, the issue with primary care not being where it needs to be, and also separately, but kind of related to that, how emergency medicine has become primary care for many. What other aspects of U.S. healthcare would you put on that list of these things aren't great? And through my years of experience, I have realized them. What else would be on that list?
Yeah, so I hope we get to the great things too, but
Sure.
One of the most interesting aspects that we're not as great at is sort of the preventative care angle. And I was able to go and study for several weeks in Cuba, and they actually have the same life expectancy and same infant mortality rate as the United States, despite spending a small fraction per capita of what we do on healthcare. And so that was pretty amazing. And the way that they work there is they simply have a physician nurse team that's basically responsible for barrio, for a neighborhood. And they know that neighborhood inside and out. Everybody in the neighborhood, they know all their healthcare issues, and they basically foster their medical care from from the nursery to the grave. It's really a remarkable system. And it was such a different approach than sort of the reactive approach we have in the United States. At the time, they only had one CT scanner in the entire island of Cuba. And that was pretty remarkable to me. We're very much more reactive. They don't have the resources really to be reactive. And so they have to prevent what they can and really try to improve the quality of people's lives before they're sick.
Okay, and I will take you up on the great things about the system, but while we're on this other list, so preventative versus reactive, what else is on this list of true issues that we need to grapple with?
Yeah, most remarkable to me is sort of the interface of pharmaceuticals with medicine, and particularly in the realm of opioids, where we have, opioids have their use in medicine. If you go in with a broken ankle to the emergency department, the standard is right now you're going to get IV morphine or something that's going to treat your pain. That's a very appropriate place for opioids. The problem is you start to wander into chronic use and chronic pain. That really is sort of an example of the failure of the interface between the medical establishment and the pharmaceutical industry in the United States. I think that the opioid crisis, as we see it, really was preventable. And there's just a few kind of aggressive moves on the part of pharmaceutical companies that really pushed the OxyContins of the world into chronic pain management, which was a big mistake. And so it's interesting, the balancing act is, companies are very incentivized in the United States to be on the cutting edge in the pharmaceutical realm. The downside is those economic interests can directly conflict with patients' best interests sometimes.
So I'm going to leave that there for a second. The economic interests not necessarily adding up to patient interests. And then I promised, please go ahead and share what, hey, here are some great things about U.S. healthcare, at least right now. What might those be?
I can say that if you're in a trauma, if you're in a car crash, there is no place that I would rather be than the United States as far as our EMS responsiveness. And I can be more specific. You look at some of these level 1 trauma centers. It truly is the pinnacle of modern medical science in the realm of trauma, and that's very important. I think that there is no better place for those who are financially enabled to receive their medical care than the United States. If you are again able to pay for it or insured appropriately, the United States really is sort of the apical medical operator. Also, research and development is heavily incentivized here in the United States, and that's partly because of the private aspects of medicine. And there's really upside for businesses in many different realms to plow into this space. And there's a fully socialized system can kind of stifle some of that innovation a little bit. So I'm very bullish on the innovation, the research in the United States. I think we do that pretty amazingly. My concern is really on those who are not financially enabled and they don't necessarily have the access that the rest of us do.
And so there is that emergency piece is emerging in this conversation as a double-edged sword. It's the best thing that we have and we're overburdening it. And so with also primary care. So if we could just separate those two, figure out something for those folks that do have an issue with being able to pay for medicine so that emergency, that best in class system can thrive, then we're on to something. Does that sound about right? Am I reading you correctly?
Yeah, for example, it is the law of the land that anybody who shows up into the emergency department is entitled to a screening exam. And on the surface of things, that is absolutely amazing. It is the right thing. The downside is when you have somebody who, for example, has a cold and maybe isn't as sophisticated, and they show up for a screening exam in the emergency department. When you start to put dozens or hundreds of patients together like that would be much more appropriately treated in urgent care or in their primary care physician, it could really bind up the system. And so it's hard to find a balancing act. I mean, I believe that everybody is entitled to a screening exam. It's just how do you do that in a more efficient way that doesn't detract care from those that are really in critical need. in the short term.
And I am hearing there's the primary care, there's urgent care, which to me is a new area, and then emergency care, correct?
Yeah.
Talk more about urgent care.
Yeah, urgent care is often staffed by very adept mid-level providers, so physician's assistants, nurse practitioners, sometimes with the remote oversight of physicians. Also, some physicians staff urgent care. Urgent care is just a step down from the emergency department. So you think about your ear infections, you think about your strep throat. A lot of things can be triaged there, and if it's a problem, they can be further moved on to the emergency departments. So,
but if I'm going in with no insurance, or I am not caught up on my insurance, I'm okay in the emergency room, as you've mentioned. Am I okay in urgent care, or is that the blanket of insurance is there, and that's why folks go to the emergency room?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's some kind of private, urgency centers, kind of between emergency room and urgent care. It's an interesting question as far as the letter of the law. Generally speaking, people are entitled to a screening exam, but it seems that the emergency department is the default. Unfortunately, you're catching me here 5 years outside of clinical practice.
That's fine.
I'm trying to remember if it applies to urgent care. Urgent care, there's a range of urgent cares. There's freestanding urgent cares. There are some that are attached to hospitals, some that are kind of a part of the emergency department. What I can say is when they're co-located, anybody showing up there is entitled to a screening exam. And I'm not sure with the freestanding urgency kind of centers, I'm not sure if that's the case, but I would believe it is.
Much like cannabis, there is a fair amount of education to society that must happen, it sounds like, as far as, now our trifurcated medical system with primary, urgent, and then emergency. It sounds like it's evolving, and, there needs to be education there, which brings us to cannabis. There needs to be education there as well. When did that hit your radar, cannabis?
Yeah, traditional medical education. So I really just saw cannabis as a recreational substance, and it was really kind of a benign recreational substance. I did receive zero training in medical school about the endocannabinoid system, which is pervasive. We have this system of receptors throughout our body, including our immune system, that basically are targeted by THC and other cannabinoids. And it's interesting to me that you can go through your entire medical school training and not learn about that. It's really interesting. So
there are other words in addition to interesting, right?
Yeah, we're working hard to fix that. For example, I do lectures with the pharmacy school here at the University of Minnesota. Our chief medical officer, Dr. Stephen Dahmer in New York, is routinely doing lectures. Now it is part of the medical school curriculum, generally speaking. It really has to be. But so back to how I got into this, there was no reason for me to look at cannabis as a medicinal substance. I can tell you 6 years ago, my mind was changed just like a switch when I saw a patient in the emergency room. I saw him, I think, 3 consecutive nights. On the third night, at about 3 a.m., he came in with this chronic back pain. He had been shot in one of the Gulf Wars. Horrible pain in his back, in his legs, just horrendous muscle spasm. As a physician, you get a pretty good sense of when people are, really legitimately in pain. And obviously there's a spectrum of how people respond. But this guy was miserable, and he was a straight shooter. Refused to use cannabis in Minnesota because it was illegal. But we got to chatting at 3 a.m. and he said, "Doc, when I was in California, I just smoked cannabis every day. I was on no opioids and I had almost no pain." And that was very compelling. I asked him, "Well, why don't you use cannabis here?" And he said, "Well, it's illegal. I've got my opioids." So that was very eye-opening for me. And that was when I thought, maybe this is real medicine. I then kind of jumped into looking into the industry in California and Colorado. And I saw a great opportunity there to just bring professionalism, bring the medicine, the science to the space. And Minnesota came up with this very restrictive, medically focused law. We were fortunate to win one of only 2 licenses here. And rapidly thereafter, we won one of only 5 in New York, really establishing ourselves as one of the first kind of professional multi-state operators, focused heavily on science, technology, engineering, and medicine. And when I entered this space, it was all about replacing opioids with cannabis, which was a much more benign alternative.
And we will get into, your what you have found, what you are finding, what you will find, from that perspective. But taking a couple steps back again and looking forward, I wonder how you see the future of healthcare and cannabis intertwining. And I will make this a more complex question by adding in that economics picture from earlier in the conversation. If we have a problem with economics within healthcare, is cannabis one of the things that can help here? So it's a complicated question. I wonder how you take it.
Yeah, I mean, my hope is that cannabinoid-based therapies, including whole plant extracts from cannabis, become a mainstay in chronic pain treatment. I think it's very likely the evidence there is going to bear out. And acknowledging that the plural of anecdotes is not evidence, but I can tell you of dozens of cases that I've seen that there's a true substantial physiologic addiction to opioids. People who've been using it for 30 years, who within weeks of starting cannabis are able to get off their opioids. The economics of it, of just that case, and I'll just give you a very simple example. 23,000 people plus die each year in the United States from prescription opioids. This is your Percocets, your Vicodins. This is not stuff that's coming in from Asia. It's not these potent fentanyl components that are killing people. It's not heroin. This is just prescription opioid overdoses leading to 23,000 deaths. That is a catastrophic expense, not just to humankind, but also to society. It's very expensive to have people overdosing on opioids. Swapping that out with cannabis is a very compelling, even if it's just a little bit of that goes away, it's a very compelling economic case. It's very affordable to make cannabis and most cannabinoid-derived medications. So that's just one case of where I see cannabis being much more affordable alternative for society.
And so that brings us to the kind of the three faces, as I understand it, of cannabis. And we've got the adult use market, and we'll leave that aside, whether that's wellness or not. We can call it wellness. Let's just call it wellness. We'll leave it there. Then there's nutraceuticals, right? Which, as we're coming to know, don't need to do those double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical trials, right? So that's that market. And then there is the cannabis as medicine going through the FDA and getting, that big check mark and it being true medicine, just like any other medicine. Have I laid out the three as you see them? Are there more segments? And what do you think of those three and others if there are?
Yeah, I just done the first one, the adult use. I really see it as a spectrum. And so just inside of these siloed state-based programs that currently exist, there's a spectrum of things that are very clearly medical uses. Most things are health and wellness. If you're replacing your scotch with a cannabis beverage or a cannabis to go to sleep at night, is that medical? Is it health and wellness? Is it adult use? And then there's very pure adult use. On the pharmaceutical side, there's sort of this single molecule route where you take just a single component of cannabis and drive that through the FDA process. That's a more traditional, one single molecule path through the FDA. There's also a little known called botanicals route through the FDA, in which a whole plant extract can work its way through the FDA route. And that's really only been used twice. I see it as very applicable to cannabis and very desirable to patients. If you have the choice between a single molecule or a whole plant extract, just on the face of things, most people are going to prefer a whole plant extract. So it's clear as mud. Right now we have this bizarre situation where you have these nutraceutical companies shipping sort of CBD across state lines, and we have these siloed state-based programs that have anything that's about 0.3% THC. And so it's going to be very interesting to see how this rolls out here over the next 3 years or so. Nutraceuticals are interesting right now. That's sort of the playground for a lot of the CBD that we see. Interestingly, the requirements around that are fairly lax. We took 11 different CBD oils, and only 3 of the 11 had anywhere near the amount of CBD stated on the label. And so that's pretty interesting. And it's really a problem. We believe our approach really is that wherever you are on the cannabis spectrum, pure adult use all the way to medical, and the bulk of people in the health and wellness side, you deserve precision, you deserve quality, and most people want the backing of science and medicine to really show them what they can expect when they take cannabis-based compounds.
A couple of things there as far as the nutraceutical division here that we're talking about. Yeah, that group must do better. We've got to be better in cannabis than a traditional industry. So just because that's the way they do it in other industries doesn't mean that that's the way we should do it in cannabis. So I'm with you.
Couldn't agree more.
I'm also realizing that you use the word interesting like my mother used to use the word interesting. We can get into that another time. But what you have uncovered here is a fourth piece, is that botanicals piece. Now, you say it's only been used twice. Is there the same type of expense that goes into the FDA single molecule, process? Or is that, can you get away with a little bit of a less expensive process there?
Yeah, qualitatively, it's a similar expense, a similar path. It's not a shortcut by any means. And the interesting question that I have is, we like to do a lot of different things. We're not afraid of the FDA path, but the question for me is, how long do these state-based programs persist? And if you can bring the same quality and exacting nature that FDA-based medications bring to the cannabis space, it seems that that's a pretty viable path in these state-based programs. And the question is, how long are they going to exist in parallel with FDA sanctioned products? And especially when you get into cannabis with the wide array of strains, wide array of components of the cannabis plant, it seems to me that these state-based programs have very significant legs. And the first kind of tranche of changes that we're going to see on the federal side is, I think, really making this, codifying the fact that this is a states' rights issue. And so I see these state-based programs really being an amazing opportunity for the foreseeable future, independent of FDA path medicines, as long as you don't run amok of something that exists there.
The laboratories of democracy and laboratories of medicine, right?
Absolutely. It's bizarre.
It is bizarre, and that is where to end it, I think, at least for this one. We've got the CEO hat on as well as the MD kind of jacket on. Do you call them jackets?
Yeah, white coats, right?
White coats. They're coats. Kyle, I really appreciate this conversation, and I can't wait for the next one. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate your time.
All right, so I just stopped recording. I stopped sharing. Yes, I do.